They said the night would be unforgettable, but not for the reason she wished. The dusty town square swelled with the noise of boots scuffing on planks, of lanterns creaking on their hooks as the wind swept through, of men's laughter and women's sharp whispers. The smell of smoke and whiskey lingered in the air, and the glow from the saloon windows spilled out like golden fire onto the ground. The people of Hollow Creek came whenever there was something to gawk at, and tonight was no different. The word had spread. A girl was being auctioned, and curiosity dragged them from their porches and poker tables, their faces eager with hunger for spectacle. She stood on a makeshift platform of wood, her wrists bound with coarse rope, her head covered by a burlap sack that scratched her cheek each time she moved. She could not see the crowd, but she felt their stares pricking her skin, their whispers cutting into her like knives. Beneath the sack, her breaths came uneven, each one tasting of dust and fear. Her heart thundered in her chest, and she pressed her lips together so hard they stung, forcing herself to stay silent. If she broke, if she cried, they would enjoy it more. The auctioneer was a thick man with a booming voice, his suspenders straining over his belly as he stepped forward with pride. He spread his arms like a showman, the lantern light catching the sheen of sweat on his brow. "Now, folks," he shouted, "tonight we've got something rare. Ain't every day you see a fine young woman offered up. Healthy, strong, ready for work, or whatever a man might have in mind. We'll start the bidding at $50. The crowd roared with laughter, some men jeering, some calling out questions that made her stomach twist. "How old is she?" One barked. "Can she cook?" Another sneered. Someone else shouted, "Don't matter what she can do, long as she's quiet." Their voices rolled together, ugly and loud, making her want to shrink inside herself until she vanished. $50. That was the price placed on her head, as though she were no more than a mule, a tool, a thing. She remembered, dimly, the house she had grown up in, the sound of her mother's laughter before sickness claimed her, the strength of her father's hands before he gambled away everything they owned. When the debts piled too high and the land slipped through his fingers, the sheriff's men had come. By then, her father was gone, her kin scattered, and she had no coin to buy her own freedom. So they brought her here, to be bartered off like worn-out goods. The bidding rose quickly, 60, then 70, then 80. The auctioneer grinned as though each number filled his own pocket. She tried not to listen, but every call tore at her like claws. These voices belonged to men she didn't know, men who might drag her into a life worse than the sack over her head. She imagined rough hands, drunken tempers, the kind of darkness she might never escape. Her knees wobbled, and she clenched her fists until her nails bit into her palms. And then, suddenly, silence. It spread through the crowd like the hush before a storm. Even through the sack, she sensed it. A new presence, heavy boots striking the ground, steady and unhurried, echoed across the wooden planks. She felt the air shift, the weight of countless eyes turning toward one man who approached. She held her breath, frozen. The boots stopped at the base of the platform. For a moment, nothing happened, and then a voice, deep and even, rolled through the night. "I'll pay whatever sum's been offered," he said. "But she ain't a prize to be toyed with." The words cut through the crowd like a blade. A few men chuckled bitterly, others muttered. The auctioneer blinked, caught off guard. "Well, sir, the bid's sittin' at." But the boots climbed the steps, one slow stride at a time, until he stood before her. She felt the warmth of his nearness, the quiet strength radiating off him like heat from a fire. And then, without hesitation, a gloved hand grasped the burlap sack, pulling it free. The lantern light stung her eyes, and she flinched at the sudden brightness. For a heartbeat, the world blurred. Then, as her vision cleared, she found herself staring into a face that stole the breath from her lungs. He was tall, his shoulders broad beneath a dust-stained coat, his hat pulled low but not enough to shadow the steel-gray eyes fixed on her. His jaw was strong, his expression firm, yet there was no cruelty there. No greed, only a steady fire, like storm clouds that had gathered but chose not to break. He looked at her as no one had in years, not as a burden, not as an object, but as though she were someone worth seeing. Gasps rippled through the crowd, men shifting uneasily, women whispering. The auctioneer fumbled with his notes, flustered. Then the man's voice rang out, calm but powerful. "I'll marry her today." The square erupted. Shocked laughter burst from some, curses from others. Someone spat on the ground. The sheriff, leaning against the post near the saloon, pushed himself upright, narrowing his eyes. "You serious, boy? Ain't nobody forced to marry," not here. You know what you're sayin'. The cowboy tipped his hat slightly, never looking away from her. His eyes held hers, steady, unflinching, as if this choice wasn't one made on a whim but carved in stone. I know, he said simply. His voice softened, just enough for her alone. She's not for sale, not anymore. The murmurs rolled through the crowd like thunder. The auctioneer sputtered, unsure if his profit had just been stolen. The sheriff watched carefully, trying to judge if this was a fool's act of rebellion or something more. But she couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Her heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. She didn't know this man's name, his past, his intentions. But when he had pulled the sack from her head and declared his choice, something inside her had shifted. The despair that had weighed her down like chains eased, just slightly, as if a crack had opened in the wall around her heart. Still, fear lingered like a shadow. What if he was lying? What if this was just another prison, dressed in the clothes of kindness? Could she really trust the strength in his voice, the promise in his eyes? She swallowed hard, her lips parting, but no words came. Her throat felt raw, her voice trapped. The sheriff stepped closer, his boots crunching on the dirt. Son, if you mean it, you best be ready to follow through. Marriage ain't just words. There'll be a preacher, a paper, and a vow you don't get to walk away from easy. The cowboy straightened, shoulders squared. Then fetch the preacher, and with that, he reached for the rope around her wrists. His fingers worked gently, careful not to scrape her skin, and in seconds, the bonds that had cut into her flesh fell loose. Her arms trembled as she lowered them, freedom making them feel strangely heavy. For the first time in months, she could move without restraint. For the first time, she could lift her eyes without shame. The crowd roared with argument, disbelief, even laughter. But none of it mattered as much as the steady gaze of the cowboy before her, who had just turned her night of humiliation into something else entirely. She stared at him, fear and hope warring inside her chest, and thought, was this the night her life ended, or the night it began? The wedding was done before she had time to understand what had happened. The preacher had been roused from his narrow bed at dawn, still buttoning his vest as he mumbled about the strangeness of it all. The papers were signed with hands that trembled, hers from nerves, his from the steady calm of someone who knew exactly what he meant. Words of vow were spoken in the small wooden chapel at the edge of town, its bell silent, its benches empty except for the sheriff, the auctioneer, and a handful of townsfolk curious enough to watch. By the time the sun slipped higher over the horizon, she was a wife in name, though her heart still stumbled over the thought. They stepped out of the chapel into the glare of morning. The air smelled of dust and horses, the town already stirring with the clatter of wagons and voices. People paused in their errands, whispering as they passed. Some shook their heads as though he had been a fool, others looked at her with a pity that made her want to shrink back inside. She held her hands tight at her sides, the cool metal of the simple ring on her finger unfamiliar, heavy with meaning she wasn't ready to carry. He led her toward his horse tied just beyond the hitching post. It was a tall, steady animal with a coat the color of chestnuts, its mane brushed smooth, reins worn from use. He untied it, turned to her, and with a gentleness that surprised her, offered his hand. She hesitated, her throat tight, but he didn't rush her. His palm was broad and calloused, yet the way he held it out felt more like a question than a command. Slowly, she placed her hand in his, and he lifted her up into the saddle. She settled nervously, skirts shifting, the height making her dizzy. Then he mounted behind her in one easy motion, the weight of him at her back, solid and reassuring. The town fell away as the horse carried them forward. Dirt roads gave way to open prairie, endless and golden under the sun. The land stretched wide, the horizon so far it seemed impossible to reach. The wind carried scents of wild sage and earth, and the sound of hooves beat steady against the ground, matching the rhythm of her unsteady heart. Neither spoke at first, silence stretching long between them. At last, unable to contain it any longer, she turned her head slightly. Why? The word escaped her lips before she could stop it, fragile, almost swallowed by the wind. Why would you do that? You don't even know me. He kept his gaze on the horizon, hands sure on the reins. His voice came steady, calm, like a river that had long known its course. Because I saw enough. He paused, letting the words sink in. You deserved better than being paraded like cattle. I couldn't stand by. Her throat tightened. She wanted to argue, to ask what he thought he had seen in her worth saving, but the words tangled inside her. She looked down at her hands, clutching the saddle horns so tight her knuckles paled. "And what if I can't give you what you want?" she whispered, the fear she had carried for so long spilling free. "What if I'm not the wife you hoped for?" For the first time, his lips curved faintly, not quite a smile but something softer. "Darlin', I didn't save you for what you could give me. I saved you because no person deserves what they were about to do. I'll never ask for more than you're willin' to give." Her breath hitched, a strange ache blooming in her chest. She had known only hands that took, voices that demanded, faces that turned away when she begged for mercy. To hear someone say he wanted nothing, just her freedom, was like stepping into sunlight after years in the dark. And yet, it frightened her. Kindness was unfamiliar. Kindness might vanish as quickly as it came. The horse carried them across rolling hills until the shape of a ranch came into view. A small cabin stood near a stretch of fenced pasture, smoke curling gently from its chimney. Beyond it lay a barn, sturdy if weather-worn, with fields rolling down into a stream that caught the glint of sun. It was not a grand place, but it was whole, and it breathed of someone's patient labor. He helped her down from the horse, his hands steady at her waist before stepping back as though to give her space. She followed him toward the cabin, her steps uncertain, eyes drinking in every detail. The porch creaked beneath her boots, the door swung open to reveal a space that smelled faintly of pine and leather. The room was simple. A hearth with a small fire, a table built strong and plain, shelves lined with tools and books, a bed neatly made. It was not wealth, but it was safe, and to her, safety felt like the rarest treasure. He stabled the horse, brought her a cup of water, and left her be. She sat at the table, hands clasped around the cup, watching the way he moved with quiet efficiency, saying little. He did not press her with questions, did not stare, did not demand anything more than her presence. When the sun began to set, painting the sky in streaks of gold and crimson, he unrolled a blanket on the floor beside the hearth. Confusion pulled at her. "You don't have to do that," she said, her voice almost too soft to hear. "It's your bed." He looked up from where he spread the blanket, his eyes steady as ever. "I said I'd marry you. Didn't say I'd take more than you're ready to give. You take your time. If all you want from me is a roof over your head and a name that keeps men away, that's what you'll have." Her throat burned, tears pressing at her eyes though she tried to blink them back. No man had ever given her such a choice before. No man had ever looked at her without reaching for something in return. Days folded into weeks, and she began to learn the rhythm of his life. He rose before dawn, the sound of his boots on the porch the first thing she heard in the morning. He worked the fields and the barn with tireless hands, his presence steady as the land itself. In the evenings, he returned with dust clinging to his coat and a weariness that never hardened into anger. Sometimes he would laugh at a stubborn horse or curse softly at a broken tool, his voice deep and warm. That laugh, rare as it was, carried something that made her chest ache in a way she couldn't name. She learned to move within his world, cooking small meals, sweeping the cabin, tending to small tasks. At first, it felt strange, like wearing someone else's skin. But gradually, she found herself humming as she worked, a melody from childhood slipping free without thought. The sound startled her. She hadn't hummed in years. One evening, she was at the stove, stirring a pot, when she turned and caught him watching her from the doorway. He leaned against the frame, his head in his hands, his eyes softer than she had ever seen them. For a moment, the air between them thickened, the firelight flickering across his face. Her heart stumbled, heat rising in her cheeks. She turned back to the pot quickly, but the echo of that gaze lingered, warming her long after. It wasn't fear anymore that stirred in her chest. It was something gentler, something terrifying in its own way. The world had broken her, sold her, stripped her of choices. Yet here she stood, in a cabin on the edge of the prairie, with a man who had given her more than she ever thought she could have again. He had given her back her voice, her freedom, her chance to breathe. And as the prairie winds carried the scent of wildflowers through the open window, she thought for the first time since she could remember that maybe, just maybe, this was where her life began anew.